Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Brianna Miranda, and I am one of now two education and outreach coordinators here at the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan. First, I want to say thank you for joining us for our first of one of four Fair Housing and Housing Development series sessions, How and Why It Matters. Today, I am joined by Alan Lazo, who will be our lead presenter during this four-part series. Alan is the former executive director of the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. He has been a longtime community advocate for civil rights and is currently serving on Oregon's Land Conservation and Development Committee. He's also working with Oregon's Housing Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee. We also were fortunate to have him join us as an expert panelist at our 2022 Annual Fair Housing Workshop Series. And we're really excited to have him back for this important series. A few housekeeping things before I turn it over to Alan. This is a webinar, so we cannot see or hear you. You can use the chat. However, if you need to request any assistance for us to unmute you, you can just type unmute and then we can unmute you that way for like the question session at the end. So please use the Q&A feature to submit questions. Questions in the chat may not get answered because they get lost in there. We will take clarifying questions during the presentation. But at the end, we definitely will have time to address any questions. So please submit them. We are here. This is an opportunity to ask any of those questions that you may have about fair housing and housing development. Additionally, we will have an evaluation that should appear in your browser. However, we will also provide a link at the end. Certificates will only be provided to those who complete the evaluation and attendance verification information. And then please allow us a few weeks to get those certificates out to you. This presentation is being recorded and the link will be sent out after the training. You can also visit our new Fair Housing and Housing Development page on our website, which will have the link to this recording, the slides, as well as any other resources that are applicable. So that is it for housekeeping. And now I would like to welcome Alan Lazo.
Great. Thank you so much, Bree, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen in the presentation here. So let's get that going. All right. Well, again, Bree, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for having me here. I'll get a little bit confused. I'm coming to you from the West Coast, and so I may confuse morning and afternoon, but good afternoon to all of you out there. As Bree said, I most recently was the executive director for 7 years at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. And the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, similar to the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan, is an organization, a private nonprofit civil rights organization whose mission is to end housing discrimination and ensure equal access to opportunity. Bree also mentioned that I'm a commissioner on our state's Land Conservation and Development Commission, and I'll let folks know what that is. It's similar to a statewide planning commission. More than 50 years ago, out here in Oregon, the state instituted a unique land use system that created a set of 19 statewide land use planning goals. And so this is the kind of the long list of statewide land use planning goals here. And what it entails is, as each city in Oregon prepares its local comprehensive plan, they must align their comp plan with these 19 statewide planning goals. So we'll talk further about this system in other sessions, and particularly we'll talk about the work that we're doing out here in Oregon around Goal 10, which is around housing. Goal 10 in Oregon is intended to provide needed housing for every person in the state of Oregon, and we will talk specifically about the intersection of that housing planning under Goal 10 across the state and fair housing. I'll say that what we noticed in our work in the fair housing movement out here in Oregon was how divorced this process of planning for housing for every person in Oregon was from the kinds of work that we did in the fair housing movement, which was really eye-opening to me, and really is what gave rise to this discussion that we've been having here for more than 5 years now about how we marry those two things together. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today and throughout the series, is really that intersection between housing development and fair housing specifically. And so, as you might have guessed, also this distance between housing planning in the state and the work that's done around fair housing out here in Oregon had led to many inequities that are rooted in part in the history of housing discrimination. And also, like so many places in this country, has also led to the housing affordability crisis that we have here in Oregon and throughout our country. So again, as we talk about this first session here about how and why it matters, I just want to be specific and note that when we talk about the it in our session today, it's really important to notice that it really is about the intersection specifically of the work we do in the fair housing movement and housing development, and particularly around land use zoning. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit this afternoon and then into the next 3 sessions also. What we recognize in the fair housing movement is that reforming land use zoning is among the ways that we can address racial and economic segregation in our country. For broader community members, they can benefit from housing affordability and choice through increased opportunities in zoning. And for those in the development community, it can provide benefits through less expensive, faster, and fewer barriers to development, particularly for mission-centered developers or often multi-unit developers that are working in affordable housing space who are most likely to encounter opposition when they come into communities. As I mentioned, I am over here on the West Coast. I actually live and have grown up here in Portland, Oregon for most of my life, and I'm coming to you from my basement in Northeast Portland today. And like a lot of folks, when I'm trying to figure out where I'm headed or trying to get somewhere, I find maps to be extraordinarily useful as a tool. But we also can use maps not only to figure out kind of how to get from one place to another, but we can also use a map to map the development of a city over time on this similar through line from past events in a community to what we know about how a community has developed today. And that can really help us to understand, how we got here today. How did we get here to today's Grand Rapids? And frankly, how we got to how nearly every place in this country is developed. And for me, as importantly as figuring out how we got here, is also making sure that we truly understand where is here. And to do that, and one of the ways I like to do that is to use this study from some researchers at Yale that there was an article about it in the New York Times several years ago. This study has also been updated to include a broader swath of respondents and has the same kinds of results. So in this study from these psychologists at Yale, they asked 100 Americans 2 questions. The first question they asked was, for every $100 earned by an average white family, how much do you think is earned by the average Black family? So it was about income. The more important or more interesting question for me was the second question they asked about wealth accumulation. It said, or asked, for every $100 in wealth accumulated by an average white family, how much wealth has the average Black family accumulated? And there's answers there, and you can think about what your answers to this might be. Does the average Black family have $0 to $25 for every $100 of wealth that the average white family has? 26 to 50, 51 to 75, or 76 to 100, or 100 plus? So think about that for a moment. I think folks that are familiar with the work are probably going to know where this lands, but there are 2 interesting things that came in this study. The first is that the reality is that the average Black family has about $8 of accumulated wealth to $100 for the average white family. But the other interesting piece that they found in this study was this gray dot on the far right here on the top line that says perception. The average answer from those 100 people in this study was that the average Black family had $83 of wealth to every $100 of wealth for the average white family. So a 78-point or 75-point perception gap between reality and perception for the racial wealth gap. one of the things the researchers said was that they suspect that the answer in part around this perception gap has to do with, quote, how little exposure Americans have to people who are unlike them. They said, given how economically and racially segregated the country remains, many Americans, and especially wealthy whites, have little direct knowledge of what life looks like for families and other demographic groups. So they attributed this perception gap to, in part, racial segregation that keeps us apart as communities. We don't have the capacity to understand how other people live in our communities. So how is it that we got here to this place in America? There are a few dynamics that we're going to cover today, this afternoon here, that have worked to segregate our communities today. There are many different dynamics that have, but we're going to talk about a few of these. You know, these and many other of the systemic and institutional policies and practices that racially segregated communities across the country, of course, are covered in Richard Rothstein's important book, The Color of Law, which, if you haven't read it, I'd highly recommend as a background in this work. And this is actually had been required reading for new staff when I was at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. So again, when we look at these dynamics that worked to segregate communities across the country, it can help us understand how we got to the Grand Rapids or the country that we have today. The first one I want to talk about are racially restricted deed covenants. And this is an example actually out here from Portland. This one, is interesting in that it has some very specific communities that it excludes from these residential areas. It says, no part of said land shall be used or occupied by any Italians, Greeks, Hindus, Armenians, or Indians, except that persons of said races may be employed therein as servants. So you couldn't live or buy a home in these neighborhoods, but you could be a servant in them. There's also an example out here from the West Coast in Seattle, Washington. Again, this one was even more exclusive. It basically, all it said was that if you could not buy or live in this property unless you were white or Caucasian. So the most common of the exclusions, though, was for Black or African-American community members, such as this list of examples of deed covenants from Grand Rapids that often prohibited Black residents from buying or living in homes. Again, the terminology from the earlier mid part of the 20th century is used here. These racially restricted deed covenants were made illegal by the Supreme Court in 1948 under Shelley versus Kramer. And even though they were unenforceable and illegal, the language remained in deeds in many older homes across the country. Michigan enacted a law in 2022, and Oregon also enacted a similar law prior to that. That was intended to make it easier to remove this racially restrictive deed language from deed covenants from language from the deeds. But there's also discussion around that in lots of parts of the country about whether or not the language should be there to reflect the history that we have and not to sanitize this history of exclusion that we have here in housing. We've also seen in a number of places, including over in Delaware County, Indiana, efforts to catalog these private deed restrictions. And one of the things we continue to see when we do that kind of work, when we acknowledge those kinds of dynamics that work to segregate our communities, is we can see that through line to the results that we have today, right? This mapped out where racially restricted deed covenants were in certain neighborhoods in Delaware County. And then when they overlaid that with the population by race, you can see that it continues to be exclusive areas. The areas in this map, the areas outlined in red, are areas that had racially restricted deed covenants. That underlying map shows the percentage of non-white residents. The areas that are lighter in color have more white residents. The areas that are darker in color have more non-white residents, more people of color. So you can see that where exclusion had started and been laid in place, it continued to today. That's a pretty common dynamic that we're going to see in these elements that work to exclude and racially segregate communities. On to the next dynamic we're going to talk about is really the role that one of the critical roles that the federal government played in racial segregation of communities, and that was really about access to capital and the enactment of the home loan guarantees under the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA. In the 1930s, FHA home loan guarantees opened up the possibility of home ownership to millions of Americans. However, the FHA instituted racially discriminatory practices in underwriting those home loans, such as this list in federal appraisal manuals in the 1930s and 40s that was used to rank neighborhoods and ranked races by the desirability for their presence in different neighborhoods. So these racist practices, here you can see that it listed, English and lighter skinned folks at the top, and then listed Black residents and Mexicans at the bottom, didn't even include Native American residents. So these racist practices then also were physically manifested in the practice that many of us are aware of around redlining, including in communities throughout Michigan, from Detroit to Muskegon. These maps, this one now for the Grand Rapids area, graded and outlined areas in green, meaning the highest grade, through red, which were the areas that were riskiest for loans in areas of a city, with the grades very often based predominantly on the racial makeup of a neighborhood. If you haven't had the opportunity to read the area descriptions that accompany the maps for each areas, they're really enlightening as to how explicit they were in using race as a factor. This is the redlined area in South Central Grand Rapids. The area description for it talks about the detrimental influences that were there and the types of inhabitants in this area. It included talking about the presence of foreign-born families, and the terminology again used for Black residents at that time it was Negroes, and it said yes, there's a presence of Negroes. Also note that here there was this distinction around foreign-born families, and when we talk about the passage of the Fair Housing Act, national origin was one of the original protected classes in the Fair Housing Act, and again, deeply rooted in the discrimination that occurred as part of this kind of work here. Another area here in Grand Rapids was the Fair Housing Center of Western Michigan. There had done a presentation with the Grand Rapids Study Club, an area that was in one of the redlined areas. And again, this is an area that had detrimental influences, as well as types of dwellings which included multifamily or smaller units were detrimental. And here you can see that it had noted a substantial presence of Black residents. The result, as you can imagine, of these racially discriminatory federal lending practices was an extraordinarily equitable impact on communities of color. Again, talking about rental and other aspects of a community, but really the biggest impact was on communities of color throughout this country. You can see in areas that had B ratings or higher that the presence of foreign-born families and people of color, particularly Black residents, was what increased grades in other areas. So what we saw with the redlining of neighborhoods was these resulting extreme racial inequities. With FHA loans made between 1934 and 1962, of $120 billion in loans made by the FHA, less than 2% went to non-white borrowers. So these institutionalized systems designed to racially segregate communities across the country then gave rise to the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was instrumental in the open housing movement, moving his family to Chicago in 1966 to directly address racial segregation that had kept Black residents in the poorest areas of the city with the least access to opportunity. The Federal Fair Housing Act was passed into a law a week after Dr. King's assassination in April of 1968. While the Federal Fair Housing Act was a hard-fought civil rights victory which made it illegal to discriminate in housing at the time based on race, color, national origin, and religion. Again, think about the factors that were used in those area descriptions for redlining maps. Even though this was an important civil rights victory, the Fair Housing Act could not undo decades of inequitable access to housing already put into place by the systems that we talked about here this morning, and that we'll be discussing further here this afternoon, this morning for us. And so as we look at these dynamics again that have led us to our communities today, we can clearly see their lasting impacts in lots of different ways that kind of, where is here that these factors have led us to. The redlining system, which was designed again to deny access to capital to particularly communities of color and particularly Black homeowners, has today left more than a 30-point gap in homeownership rates between white and Black residents. A gap higher or as high as it was in 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. When we look at the geospatial impact of redlining in communities today, such here as in Grand Rapids, if we zoom in on this map, there's a clear correlation between the originally redlined communities that are in the darker hatched colors here, the red, yellow, and blue and green hatching, and the continued concentration of people of color, and again, particularly in areas with least access to opportunity. That's the map that's underlaid here in this map from the Michigan State University. Of the 7 originally degraded or redlined neighborhoods in Grand Rapids, when those were the only neighborhoods and that at the time in 1937 that had any Black residents, 4 of them still have more than half of the residents that are people of color. Conversely, 6 of the A-rated or green line neighborhoods are still predominantly white. For 3 of them, the largest segments of the neighborhoods are at least 90% white: Ravenswood, Fisk Lake, and Cascadia. So again, geospatially, the perpetuation of that racial segregation that was put into place through these systems continues through today. Economically, unsurprisingly, home values today continue to mirror the grades from the green lined and red line maps that were put in place nearly 100 years ago now and put in place to make investments in our neighborhoods. As you see in this graph, the home values in previously green line neighborhoods rose more significantly than other neighborhoods, and values in previously red line neighborhoods continue to fall behind. This Zillow analysis said that looking back to 1996 shows that at the time, the median home value in redlined neighborhoods was 47% that of areas rated best in the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps, or HOLC maps. And the gap has worsened since then. The median home value in the best or green line neighborhoods has risen 230.8% to $640,238 over the past 22 years when this graph was created, whereas the median value in the areas rated hazardous or redline has climbed only 203.1% to $276,199. The other thing I'll point out, and this is for a nationwide comparison of all areas that were redlined. I think one of the things that's really interesting about this graph is if you look here, when it goes back to 1996, you can see the red line neighborhoods are tracking just below the yellow line neighborhoods. And then you start to see it cross over here. And then when we get further out here into the 2010s, 2015s, you see the red line begin to accelerate above the yellow line. And that, in many cases, is the impact of gentrification and displacement from redline neighborhoods. We know that's common in lots of areas that were redlined, where investment comes in, begins to increase home prices, and displaces the original residents that were there. So this dynamic holds true also if we look specifically at Grand Rapids. And again, this is the redlining map for the Grand Rapids area. And we bring in the the same graph from Zillow that compares the red lined, green line, yellow, and blue line areas for the Grand Rapids area. You'll see here that in the Grand Rapids area, there hasn't been the involuntary displacement and gentrification of neighborhoods. You see the red line still remains well below even the yellow line neighborhoods in the Grand Rapids area. So those are some common dynamics that I think often think about, often know about, related to how our communities are so racially segregated today. The one I'll switch to next. There's another Zillow graph that just shows again on a map the areas that have lower home values relative to their redlining area or green lined areas, in the Grand Rapids area. So again, now I'll turn to the third dynamic that I want to touch on today, and this is perhaps the most nefarious of those systems and institutions that were intended to racially segregate communities. Nefarious to me for its ubiquity and unseen inequities today, and that's really single family unit detached residential zoning. So as we're talking about the intersections specifically of the work we do in fair housing and land use zoning, there are a few areas that I want to cover. We'll cover predominantly this first section today around the historical intent to exclude and the continuing impacts in communities today from single family or single unit detached residential zoning. But there are other intersections with fair housing that we'll want to talk about. We'll touch on them a little bit today and talk about kind of where we're headed with regard to some of these. There are areas of form and function in land use zoning and in code requirements that we can talk about that relate to fair housing, that might relate to, as we've seen, allowed uses by different zones, as well as specific impacts on members of protected classes who are most likely to experience discrimination. I think one of the easier ways for us to think about it, in particular, are folks that are living with disabilities and how accessibility might relate to what's available in zoning codes or what's required in development codes. And then the third area that we'll talk about and is really around NIMBYism, or not in my backyardism, and really how it plays into how our communities have developed, and then further how we get to yes when we talk about housing development in our communities. When we return to our analogy about our map, we actually need to travel back in time along our timeline to look at the origins of racially exclusive zoning in the history of the development of our communities. Explicit racial exclusion by zoning actually took place prior to these other dynamics that we talked about today. It took place in the early part of the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, single-family zoning originally was designed explicitly as a system to segregate by race in our neighborhoods. The first example was here in Baltimore in 1910, where a law made it illegal for Black residents to move onto a block that was more than half white residents. This is a New York Times article that had that highlighted the plan that Boston was to put into place to racially segregate its community by zoning. And this is actually the language for that example in Baltimore, again, that made it illegal for Black residents to move onto a block that was more than half white residents. So it said that no Negro could move onto a block in which more than half the residents are white. And conversely, it said that no white person could move onto a block that was more than half residents who were colored or Black. This racially explicit zoning was struck down by the Supreme Court in the 1917 case Buchanan versus Worley, that recognized that even though a city might have a legitimate interest in, quote, the promotion of public health, safety, and welfare through zoning, the law could not justify, quote, the direct violation of the fundamental law enacted in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, preventing state interference with property rights except by due process of law. So it wasn't an issue about racial justice. It was an issue about property rights and to whom you could sell your home, which is kind of a common theme we saw in the early part of the 20th century, that lots of these issues weren't struck down based on the racial nature of them, but on property rights. And that's another theme that continues through to today, that perpetuates this sense that private property rights override greater needs in our communities. But going back to the Buchanan versus Worley ruling in 1917, this then gave rise to these other nefarious practices nationwide around land use zoning that utilized proxies for race, namely economic status, as a means of exclusion in the form of single-family residential zoning. Also note here that this also, because this was, again, back in our timeline before racially restricted deed covenants, before the FHA, it also led white homeowners and developers to other forms of racial segregation, those ones that we discussed earlier this afternoon. It gave rise in the 1930s, after the court case, to the exclusionary practices like those deed covenants. It also was the era that we saw racial steering by real estate agents, and then, of course, the redlining maps that were used to deny access to capital. But in zoning, what you saw after the Buchanan versus Worley case is that across the country in the 1920s, there was this planning movement to create single-family residential zones that would exclude Black residents and other residents economically, because planning efforts could no longer exclude explicitly by race. In 1916, just 8 US cities had zoning ordinances, just prior to Buchanan. By 1936, that number had grown to 1,246. The Supreme Court also did uphold these policies in Euclid versus Ambler in 1926, this policy around being able to use zones and districts for certain purposes. The Supreme Court found at that time that, according to a report by the Century Foundation, that excluding apartments and multifamily homes from entire neighborhoods was not just permissible, but could potentially prevent the degradation of an area. An apartment house could be, quote, from the Supreme Court, a mere parasite constructed in order to take advantage of the open spaces and attractive surroundings created by the residential character of a neighborhood. That's what the court wrote. And they, without failing to consider, as we might even think about today, that those unable to afford single-family homes would then be excluded from those same residential bliss, the same residential opportunities that might be deemed so worthy of protection by these zones. So that sense that we are excluding folks not just from forms of housing, but from the access to opportunity that housing provides. As Richard Rothstein lays out in his book, The Color of Law, this was intentional, systemic, and institutional, especially at the federal level. And he notes there was little doubt about who the persons to be avoided might be. We're going to talk in more detail about these exclusionary zoning and how it plays out in current day Grand Rapids for you all in our upcoming webinar sessions, but I also wanted to share with you details about how this has played out for us here in Portland. Because we have some examples and some maps that have already been laid out here. Portland instituted its first single-family residential zones during this era, during the early part of the 20th century, when its first zoning map was created in 1924. This map here shows the yellow zones that were the first single-family residential zones. Now, there isn't evidence of the record to say that Portland's single-family residential zoning was created intentionally to exclude by race, but it was created in that atmosphere when that was the predominant thinking across the country. And here in Portland, it was actually the realtors and the neighborhoods that requested this exclusionary zoning. So if the neighborhood could go to the city and ask to be zoned single-family residential only. And so that's how the zones came about. It wasn't actually part of a planning process. It was sort of the original neighborhood impacts. So even if the explicit intent wasn't to exclude by race, Oh, we have a question about, yes. So Jay had asked in the chat about the exclusion of Black residents in Oregon. Yes, Oregon in its constitution actually banned Black residents. It was going to be a free state, but Black residents could not come to Oregon. And so it is one of the reasons that Oregon and much of the West Coast is particularly the northwest corner of the West Coast has such a high white population, because Black residents were actually excluded from coming here to Oregon. There weren't a lot of cases where that was enforced, but as we talk about it, it's a pretty clear message about who would be welcome in this part of the country. So again, even if the explicit intent, just like we talked about the exclusion of Black residents from Oregon itself, even if the explicit intent wasn't to exclude by race, and actually the reasoning for excluding Black residents from Oregon was supposedly economic at the time, right? That they didn't want to bring cheap labor here from the South to compete with labor that was here in Oregon. So that was the reason that Black residents were excluded from the state of Oregon. But similarly, even if the explicit intent wasn't to exclude by race, the impact of exclusionary zoning or exclusion really has had that outcome. As I said, in the state of Oregon, we have a small Black population, and in exclusionary zones, this really has both an economic impact as well as, by extension, a racial impact. And we can see that, again, direct correlation when we look at these maps here in Portland. Again, these are the original 17 single-family residential zones in Portland. And if you overlay them over the highest income areas in the city, you can see that direct correlation between the original exclusion of certain folks or certain types and where we ended up today. Unsurprisingly, we could also overlay this same map. This has the areas of high affluence underneath the 17 original single-family zones. If we bring in Portland's redlining map, this is the redlining, the map for Portland. This is the Homeowners Loan Corporation. You can begin to see some of the patterns here and try to overlay the other map. You begin to see, again, the layered impacts of these different systems in creating racial segregation in our communities. So again, while these maps were created for Portland and some of the work that we've been involved out here, these correlations between historical events such as redlining and exclusionary zoning, we see these same outcomes in communities today across the country and would be commonplace in many, many cities. Similarly, prior to legislative changes here in Oregon that we're going to discuss in our upcoming webinars a little bit today, like many other places in the country, more than 3/4 of the land zoned for residential use in Portland had been zoned for single family or single unit detached homes. And across the country, 75% of the land zoned for residential use in the US is zoned for single unit detached homes, following that pattern that was originally, again, set in place to exclude by race, and what we now think of as commonplace, or in part of the American dream in how we develop our communities. As I noted, the Supreme Court had upheld in 1926 this Euclidean form of land use zoning that continues today, and again allows cities to use zoning to separate different land uses into distinct zones and areas. And when that form of land use zoning continues today, and with single unit detached zoning, it includes very often restrictions around minimum lot sizes and other exclusionary measures that can have impacts on various communities. And again, in particular, when we talk about particular intersections with work that we do in fair housing, and continues to perpetuate, again, that initial intent of zoning to economically exclude certain residents. Now, certainly there are other intents for zoning to separate folks from hazardous activities, put those in separate zones, put those in different places. But as you saw from this, one of the original intents really was around separating certain types of people. And as I noted, again, the use of zoning as a means to segregate communities is particularly nefarious, in part due to how few people really view this system as exclusionary or as having roots that are exclusionary. We shouldn't be surprised, again, that these systems that were designed to segregate people by race worked to racially segregate communities across the country. But what we should be surprised by, concerned about, is that we haven't yet acknowledged and addressed these systems today that continue to perpetuate racial and economic segregation in the form of residential land use zoning. And just as Richard Rothstein's Color of Law, and now the follow-up to that Just Action with his daughter, has helped bring to light so many of these practices around racial segregation, particularly, for the Rothsteins at the hands of the federal government, we're seeing a groundswell of light and action related to the exclusionary nature of zoning. There are a couple of recent books that highlight the role of zoning and how our communities have developed and come to be today. We're also seeing increased acknowledgement of the role of zoning from government jurisdictions. This here from Governing Magazine about, again, highlighting that connection. This is an article in 2023, so just this last fall, about the connection between zoning and racial discrimination, and particularly housing discrimination. Here they note that how they continue to stand in the way of affordable and equitable housing, which I think is really true. And the work we're doing out here in Oregon is to marry housing development with fair and equitable outcomes. And so again, it also notes that the place to start here is through restrictive single-family zoning. We also have seen that, in the same way, this is a piece on CNN about the invisible laws that led to America's housing crisis. So this underlying sense that exclusionary zoning is part of what has created not only the shortage of housing in America, but the affordability crisis that so many communities are experiencing. So, again, when I looked at that list, we've covered kind of the history around the intent of land use zoning, its continued impacts today. This delves a little bit more into the form and function of land use code planning and zoning and code development. And then the other interesting dynamic that has accompanied this narrative around zoning and its development really is the role of the public engagement in the land use process, and how it really gave rise to NIMBYism, or what's commonly known as not in my backyard, not in my backyardism. So that this is a process then that folks started to use to oppose the inclusion of certain types of housing in their neighborhoods, or certain types of uses in their neighborhoods. So we'll discuss that these dynamics further and really talk about what the role of NIMBYism has been in the development, and how we might, again, work better to get to yes in our communities, or even regulate yes in our communities in housing development. The other thing we know, that this period of really acknowledging the role of land use zoning has also been punctuated with numerous national stories about efforts to end the practice of exclusionary zoning in communities. What was claimed to be the first, or that received and there's something in the chat, would at least receive notoriety as the first real major effort, was Minneapolis back in 2008, which included headlines like this that again noted the role of addressing racial segregation in the desire to end exclusionary zoning. Out here in Oregon, we've also been involved in high-profile changes to our single-unit detached land use zones under that statewide land use planning system that I noted in my introduction. And again, we'll talk more extensively about those efforts and outcomes in our upcoming webinars. But really, again, over the last 5 years, we've kind of evolved from working to end, as these screamer headlines talk about, they talk about outlawing single family homes, which is not true. What it did was open up and in some cases re-legalize the opportunity to put in middle housing. You know, the first move was really around accessory dwelling units. We saw a movement around that, and then we saw a movement around middle housing, duplexes, triplexes, cottage clusters, which now are legal in every residential zone in Oregon. And then the piece that we've been working on predominantly around the intersection of fair housing and land use zoning is really marrying again this housing planning process that we have in Oregon, the statewide process, with fair housing. And we've actually worked to integrate much of the fair housing concepts into that work coming up. We're right in the midst of that work right now. So we'll talk more about that in upcoming webinars. And Suzanne correctly noted that actually Grand Rapids, as many of you are aware, actually many years ago, prior to these much more lauded efforts, had made changes to its zoning that explicitly moved away from defining residential zones by type and use, and in my understanding, moved more towards a form-based system where residential districts are defined as low or mixed density and allow most housing types by right, and through a simpler exceptions process. So yeah, Grand Rapids has been doing it for 10 years. It'll be really interesting to talk about and see how the outcomes have been. Again, you know, the hope for outcomes from these kinds of changes would be that we increase the integration of housing types and the types of community members that are in our communities. All right, we're going to save some questions for later too. So these reforms also throughout the country have not gone unnoticed, right? There's this national zoning reform tracker at the University of California, Berkeley's Othering and Belonging Institute. So the Othering and Belonging Institute has done really extensive work in the San Francisco Bay Area on acknowledging and addressing exclusionary zoning. With Berkeley being one of the first places in the country to institute that exclusionary single-family zoning in the early part of the 20th century. And then we can also look to the Fair Housing Act, as I noted its passage in 1968. While it was an attempt to end discrimination in housing, in part based on race, it actually did little to redress the systems that were left in place to perpetuate many inequities. In this commentary from the Century Foundation, again, they note also that the Fair Housing Act, passed 1 week after Dr. King's murder in 1968, was a valiant attempt to both build and secure Dr. King's increasingly bold dream. But the legacy of the act, which requires cities receiving federal dollars to prohibit housing discrimination and take active steps towards integration, has been dampened by poor or incomplete enforcement and pervasive policies that exclude poor and middle-class Americans from the highest opportunity neighborhoods. And as we've been talking about this afternoon, really related to the impact of single unit detached zoning in our communities. So again, as the Century Foundation talks about here with regard to the Fair Housing Act, you know, one of the hopeful pieces that is available to us in the Act is a concept called affirmatively furthering fair housing. You know, practitioners are in the fair housing movement are deeply dedicated to the work of ending housing discrimination. And we also recognize that we need more and better tools to address racial inequities. And again, affirmatively furthering is one of those ways that we find hope in the Act itself. Affirmatively furthering calls on those recipients of federal funds from HUD to not just end housing discrimination, but to proactively address segregation and integration in their communities. We'll just cover briefly the Federal Fair Housing, the Federal Fair Housing Act it has 7 protected classes, so it's illegal to discriminate in housing based on race, color, national origin, and religion. Sex, including sexual orientation and gender identity, was added in the 70s, and then familial status and disability were added as protected classes in 1988. So again, affirmatively furthering requires federal fund recipients to in their administering and activities related to housing and community development. So not just to housing, but but all aspects of community development. So this could include the provision of utilities or transportation systems, right? You're required to determine who lacks access to opportunity and address any inequity among protected class groups, those 7 protected federal classes, promote integration and reduce segregation, and to transform racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity. AFFH, or Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, again, is as well as an accompanying concept called disparate impact, where a rule or practice on its face that might be neutral might have a disparate impact on a protected class, is another way for us to potentially help enforce inequities that are related to otherwise neutral rules. But this piece of Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing is part of what we have worked to integrate into that Oregon housing planning system. Again, I always tell folks that I feel really fortunate to be in this bubble in Oregon where folks are really committed to this kind of work and really committed to this kind of equitable outcomes. And so it's been really enriching and heartening to be able to do this work, to incorporate it into the statewide housing planning that we have. It's also really fantastic to have that statewide framework in place that allows us to have a really big impact on the work that's happening out here. So with that, we're going to switch over to questions. Before we do that, I'm just going to talk a tiny bit about the next sessions. The sessions 2, 3, and 4 will be in June, July, and August. In session 2, we're going to talk further about this intersection between zoning and land use and fair housing, and specifically about aspects of the act that would relate to zoning and land use. And then in sessions 3 and 4, again, we'll continue with development, zoning, and fair housing intersections, and how folks that might approach it from different angles, whether those are advocates in the community or people working in jurisdictions, can work with these concepts. So with that, again, thank you so much for having me here this afternoon. And I look forward to seeing you in our upcoming sessions. And I'll turn it back to Bree, who's been tracking questions. And I know we've got some in the chat. And Bree, where would you like to head?
Yeah, we do have a really good question. It's a big question from Jay in the chat. Do we think the federal government will ever allocate money to repair, renovate, and develop neighborhoods that were redlined? I think that's a really good, big question.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's hard for me to speak on behalf of the federal government, but certainly in the work that we all are involved in the fair housing movement, my hope is the answer is yes, right? And it's one of the ways that we can specifically redress this history, and that's really what's needed moving forward. If you listen to Richard Rothstein or his daughter Leah talk, their new book, Just Action, really is a call for a new or revitalized civil rights movement. And this opportunity to specifically redress these issues. One of the issues in trying to use the Federal Fair Housing Act now is that it is race neutral. So it actually wouldn't allow us to make investments by race. So could we use a proxy like areas that were redlined? Yeah, I think we could. What I say often in talking to folks about solutions isn't that we actually don't know what the solution is. What we don't have is either the political or social will to actually do that. During the pandemic, we saw some investments that were made specifically during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll say, be specific. We saw some investments that went to the Black community specifically, and particularly to Black businesses. And what we saw were legal challenges to that, based on folks feeling like that was not fair, that investments would be made to specifically Black communities who were greatly impacted for lots of the reasons that we talked about today, frankly, by the aspects of the pandemic. So yeah, I think it's a possibility and should be on the table. I don't know that we'll get there.
Yeah, that's a really great answer. I think you covered all the things that I think we are all thinking about when within that answer. Very hopeful, but it maybe not anytime soon.
Yeah.
We have another good question. Can you talk about the challenges of ensuring affordable housing lately? It sounds like a lot of LIHTC and other affordable housing deals nationally are having trouble ensuring due to high rates. And they're wondering if this is a new form of redlining emerging. It's a really great question.
Yeah, thanks. And I really appreciate the aspect of bringing in this, is this just another form of redlining? And I did want to mention that what we saw in lots of these dynamics is this transition from this explicit form of exclusion or discrimination to it being made illegal, and then we see it transitioning into an implicit forms, right? We don't see that with single-family residential zoning. That's kind of one of the things I was talking about, that thread that says it started out explicitly, was made illegal by the Supreme Court, but now it has this implicit impact of still excluding racially, and which we need to address and identify. That's also true of redlining, and I agree with you. I don't know if what's happening just on the affordable housing front is part of that, but certainly the impact of insurance rates, of appraisals, of bank lending, all feel like implicit forms of redlining today in communities, right? Um, I think for housing developers, the issues around supply, around insurance, yes, are big issues in us being able to actually develop housing. And I think that's a little bit different than whether or not it's purposeful or implicit redlining. I think that's another issue that does need to get addressed. I think it is the person asking the question says, if it's related specifically to LIHTC, then yeah, I'd be concerned about the impact on certain communities. And particularly if you went further and said the impact was insurance rates based on LIHTC, based in certain communities or based in certain places, right? That really then feels like it's a barrier to integrating communities. And so that's what we'd be looking for, right? How can we see that actual intersection? If it's across the board, then that's a real problem just for our development work in general. But when it specifically intersects with how we serve certain protected classes, and we know that certain members of protected classes most likely to experience discrimination are also most likely to access affordable housing, right? Then we do begin to see those intersections. And so that's how you'd want to look at it. Is there particular impacts being made on certain communities? And again, the tie to LIHTC might be the place, but my sense is we're seeing it across the board. We hear it from lots of even private market developers about insurance rates, about supply chain, all those things.
Thank you. And then we have another question here. It's a big question. What you kind of talked about this, but what do you think is the toughest barrier we face in this work?
The toughest barrier. Well, I think the toughest barrier, I think despite the market, I think from our perspective in the movement, the toughest barrier really is around NIMBYism and overcoming the costs of bringing those kinds of developments to high opportunity areas. It's an interesting piece to think about as with regard to how we actually solve that. And so there's lots of different ways. I'm not sure a soft approach is going to be effective enough, quickly enough for us, right? I think changing hearts and minds is going to take longer than we need to really get the housing we need. The other way to do it is to institute that kind of development by right, right? And that's as I talked about in Grand Rapids, it looks like that's kind of the work that you are doing there. We're seeing that across the country. We certainly want to make sure we leave open the opportunity for public engagement, but we also need to make sure that we're balancing that with the extreme need for housing across our country. And so, as a commissioner on the State Land Conservation and Development Commission, we're constantly trying to figure out how to balance that, and every community is. And so, in the work we're doing, I see that as a big barrier.
Yeah. And then we do have a question that may not really fall into this realm, but there, there's some correlation there. I think with the rise. So this question is on how does Airbnb impact the housing situation, and is that a barrier as well? Which I think is
Yeah.
a really great question, really timely question, as I think a lot of communities are seeing Airbnbs come on online.
Yeah. Well, I think it's fair to talk about all aspects of what impacts our housing availability and housing affordability in all our communities. And one of the things I noted, I didn't put it together, but I think there's some real comparisons about where I am in Portland and in Oregon to where you all are in Michigan and Western Michigan. One of the things we've experienced out here, and I think probably what you have out there with regard to Airbnbs, is particularly in tourist destinations. So communities that have high levels of tourism might have short-term rentals. I won't single out Airbnb, but all short-term rentals, right? And those short-term rentals are taking away from the housing stock that would be available otherwise to members of the community. And when we know that where we see the greatest impact are going to be, again, those members of protected classes who are most likely to experience discrimination. And so we see it in Oregon showing up particularly for folks who work in those communities and aren't able to live in those same communities. Not only folks who might work in stores or restaurants, we also see it in some really highly tourist supported areas, teachers and folks who work in hospitals. So, we have seen communities that are working to regulate short-term rentals, under the guise of the work that needs to be done in housing. So it's both short-term rentals, and we also have lots of communities here where folks own a second home, they own a vacation home. And so again, areas that are desirable for vacationing are also desirable for second homes. And so those pieces are also on the table. We have seen some local communities that are looking at regulating short-term rentals. And Lisa followed up by saying that she understands that property owners are choosing to do, choosing to do short-term rental versus Section 8 options. Yeah. And so I think it's a lot like any other dynamic we see in the housing marketplace, that where housing choice voucher holders are having to compete with any other type of housing use that might be put in. That certainly is a form of, or could be, I don't know if it could be a direct form of discrimination, but certainly has a direct impact on housing choice voucher holders. One of the things I'm hopeful that we'll see across the country, Oregon has had protections for Section 8 or housing choice voucher holders. I don't know how many years now, but I think we're seeing a movement across the country to see that housing assistance as a protected class eventually. And I think already is starting to get there in part based on the disparate impact provisions, and the likelihood that it's more likely that certain members of protected classes need to access housing assistance and do so across the country. So I think we see some protections there. It's interesting to think about the impact of short-term rentals versus the opportunity to use the housing choice vouchers there. Yeah. Certainly anything that shrinks the marketplace is difficult.
Yeah, that is interesting. Grand Rapids is one of a few local communities in in West Michigan that has source of income protection. So that is an interesting comment, to think that there are some owners that are choosing to lease things, not lease, but rent, versus offering the vouchers.
Yeah.
That
And we see
is
other ways that folks try to evade the source of income protections. It's right down to, in some communities, folks keeping their dwellings below habitable standards so that they don't pass inspections. Those kinds of things, or raising their rents to the level that it's above the payment standards. So yeah, it's difficult to, anytime you try to regulate or tamp down on abuses, other abuses are gonna rise up. And certainly if there's a sense that short-term rentals is one of the ways that folks are evading a source of income protections, that's tough to think about.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. And then I think, and then please put any more questions in the Q&A or the chat. We are here until 2, or we have Alan until 2:15. You kind of mentioned some books, you mentioned The Color of Law and then Just Action, and then you had the other 2 options. Is there any other books recommendations that you would have for people that are maybe kind of new to this topic or want to explore more things along this topic? And the other ones you mentioned, I will add to our resource list. So any other ones you mentioned, we can continue to add them to our webpage as well.
Yeah, thanks. I'm one of these people who has a stack of about 10 or 12 books next to my on my bedside table, and so I'd be vain to recommend too many more books for folks, because that's already 4 that I think are really important right now, and particularly Color of Law and Just Action. I'm about a third of the way through Just Action, and we had Richard Rothstein out, like a lot of folks did, to speak, and one of the things he talked about was how often when he was out, he was asked, okay, well, this is all fine and good, but what can we do? And that's really what gave rise to Just Action. And so I don't know how quickly folks get through books, but I think those 2 are really important. And I think it's really interesting that how Richard Rothstein came to his work. He and the reason he brought his daughter in is because he wasn't a housing policy person, and his daughter Leah apparently is. But his work was in education, and so and he really came to the work from recognizing the impacts in access to education from racial segregation in housing. And so, it really tells us again how broad that those impacts are in the kind of work that we're looking at in ending racial segregation and working to integrate communities.
And then we also do want to note somebody did recommend or they said they're currently reading a book, Homesick: Why Housing is Unaffordable and How We Can Change It, by Brendan O'Brien, which speaks directly to some of that impact of short-term rentals that we were just discussing. So thank you, Abby, for that recommendation there. We can also add that to our page. We can maybe create a little book section. This seems to be an interest to folks. And I think I'll leave off with one more question. And I guess, is there anything that you didn't talk about today? I mean, we have 3 more parts to this series, but is there one last thing you wish more people knew about this topic or thought about regarding this topic? And you went over a lot, so you might have covered everything, but I just wanted to give that space that if there was one more thing you wanted to leave us off on.
Yeah, thanks, Bree. I don't think there's anything specific as far as facts, but I think the one thing I would leave folks with is, I sort of facetiously approached it by using that map that talked about the through line, about how we get from here to there. But it really is a very serious note about recognizing, the first step in recognizing how we got to where we are today is really recognizing the impacts of that. So it's not enough for us just to know and be able to recite the history that we talked about today. It's really recognizing the impact that it's had today, the patterns that we see on the ground today, and acknowledging that that's how we got here and that that's where we are today. Because that leads us then into the next sessions. Then it really does prompt us to say, okay, there are some specific things that we can address and redress to move us forward and move us beyond those historical events and those things that got us to where we are today. So it really is that connection to those 2 pieces that I think I'd like to leave folks with. And if you want to tell your friends where to start, then they need to start by first understanding and then acknowledging that history and how it continues to impact us today. And then we can move forward in the conversation with that knowledge.
Thanks so much, Alan. Excuse me. We did have one more question come in. So that was a really great way to end it, but we do have one more question. Seems like opposition to density centers around concerns of gentrification and displacement, not parking those people, noise, etc. Are there any good sources to help planners speak to this?
I don't have any offhand, but I would, there's the American Planning Association actually put out an equity in planning guide. And I think there's just lots of conversation right now about how we do this. And so I think it's worth paying attention, and particularly in the planning profession right now. I think we're seeing a lot of conversation about that. And I think that what I'd say about gentrification and displacement is it is really an interesting dynamic to hold, right? We very often, and so I think we need to think carefully about what it is we're trying to accomplish. Many communities that were redlined are actually asking for that investment, right? What we actually need is, even as HUD tells us, is to transform those into areas of opportunity. As you pointed out here, the balance is, how do we do that without displacing the folks that are there, right? And so I do lots of reading about that. I'm not sure that there are very many places that have figured that out yet, but I think that is one of the tasks before us, because it really is part of the opportunity, not just to move folks out of areas that had been previously redlined, but to turn areas that previously were redlined into areas of opportunity without displacing folks from there, right? To actually have that red line pass the yellow line, the blue line, the green line, and benefit the residents that are there. So it's a real challenge, but I don't have any resources on it offhand.
And maybe that's something that comes out of
Yeah.
the series,
Yeah.
or as we go forward and bring in some other speakers, maybe there'll be other things. So we'll continue to the folks that may not be able to attend our other sessions. We will be uploading resources and things to that link that Liz did post in the chat. It's fhcwm.org/fair housing development series. But it is in the chat. So yeah, thank you so much, Alan. Really appreciate your time, and we're excited to continue this series. This was a great foundation, and we're so excited to have your knowledge throughout the rest of the series. With that being said, we will also be sending out information on the next session. So please stay tuned to that, and plan to join us next month on June 14th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, where we'll dive deeper into law and equitable solutions in Michigan. Alan will be joined by Tyler Oxt from the MSU Extension, which Alan kind of highlighted some of their resources there. So we will have the both of them join us next month. Included in the email you receive tomorrow, you will also get the link to this recording, any resources, and the PowerPoint as well, if we or that'll be on the page. And then lastly, please don't forget to complete the evaluation, which Liz posted in the chat as well. And yeah, that is it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Alan, and have a good rest of your day.